Have you ever felt like something isn't quite right? Like you're being watched? Or something's lurking just out of sight? Tonight, I want to share with you a story that might just make you think twice the next time you're alone at night. It's a tale of shadows, whispers, and that eerie feeling when reality starts to bend. So, grab a seat, get comfortable, and let me take you into a world where fear is just one step behind you. Don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Let's talk about your creepiest experiences. I'd love to hear from you. It was one of those nights when everything seemed to fall into place for a peaceful sleep. The house was still, quiet, and empty, as it often was when I was alone. The only sounds that filled the room were the soft hum of the fan and the occasional rustling of leaves outside the window. I had long since settled into my bed, the comfort of my blankets wrapping me in warmth. But as I drifted off into sleep, something felt off. I couldn't place it at first, but it was there, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Then, in the dead of night, I woke up. At first I thought it was just the transition between dreams and reality, the kind of sleep fog that tricks your senses. But no, this time it was different. I could hear it, a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from somewhere in the room. It was faint at first, almost like the sound of wind brushing through the trees outside. But there was something distinct about it, something human. The voice was too close, too familiar. I sat up in bed, straining my ears to catch the next sound. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't just the creaking of the house. There it was again, a whisper, a voice, not loud but definitely present. It was calling my name. At first I thought I was dreaming, that my mind was playing tricks on me in my half-sleeping state. But then the voice repeated my name again, clearer this time. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to shake it off. It's just the wind, I told myself. Just the house settling, just the usual sounds of a house at night. But the voice didn't go away. It lingered, like a presence in the room with me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself to ignore it, to calm down. But how could I? It felt too real, too personal. I reached over and fumbled with the bedside lamp, trying to illuminate the room and erase the creeping sense of dread. As the light flickered on, I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing at the foot of my bed. Of course, there was no one. The room was empty. The shadows stretched along the walls, as they always did at night. But the voice, it didn't stop. It wasn't just random noise. It felt as if it was reaching out to me, as if it knew me, knew who I was. I sat frozen for a moment, my mind racing. It must be some sort of glitch, I thought, thinking of the many gadgets in my room, my phone, my computer, the smart speaker. Maybe it was a malfunction, a random trigger in one of the devices. I quickly checked my phone to see if any apps were running or malfunctioning. Nothing. My phone was silent, untouched. Still, the voice wouldn't leave me. I turned off everything. The fan, the lights, my phone. I wanted to erase any potential source of sound. I sat there in the dark, heart racing, waiting for silence. But it didn't come. The whisper was still there. Only now it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't random noise. It was a sentence. The words were clear as day, but they didn't make sense. It's Thursday, July 4th, 1776, the voice said. A chill ran down my spine. That was impossible. What was that? Why would that be the response to... What? Was my house haunted? Was someone playing a prank? Or worse, was there something more sinister at play? I didn't know. I couldn't explain it. The rational part of my brain told me it was just a glitch, a malfunction in some device, some unseen cause. But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. I tried to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. I closed my eyes, hoping for the nightmare to fade, to slip away into the night. But no matter how much I tried to shake it off, the voice remained etched in my mind. That voice, calling me, saying things that shouldn't have made sense, that couldn't have made sense. As I lay there, still and quiet, the voice came again. This time, it was even closer. My full name. And this time, it wasn't just a random sentence. It was a message. The voice said, "Here's the information for my name." I froze, my body cold with fear. This wasn't just a glitch. It wasn't just a weird dream. It felt too real, too intentional. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I rushed out of bed, ran down the hallway, and locked myself in my parents' room. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't explain, something that didn't make sense. And yet, as I lay there in the dark, listening to the silence, I still couldn't convince myself it was just a glitch. Could it really be that simple? Or was I just fooling myself into believing that? As I lay in the stillness of the room, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had settled over me, something unexpected happened. That voice began to grow louder. But this time, it wasn't just floating in the air. It was coming from a source I hadn't even thought to check. My phone. I glanced over at the table where my phone lay, charging quietly, as it had been for the past few hours. At first, I wondered if maybe the voice was coming from an app or a notification I hadn't noticed. No way, I thought to myself. It's just a glitch. Maybe some weird voice memo or app playing in the background. But when I heard the voice again, I realized I had been wrong. It wasn't coming from a random source. It was coming from Siri. I rushed over to the phone, half expecting to find some strange setting that had triggered Siri's voice. "Who's there?" I muttered under my breath. I quickly checked the screen. There it was, the usual Siri interface. But there was no question, no request. It was just a response. "Who is this?" I asked, almost out of habit, feeling foolish for talking to a device. But the voice responded again, eerily calm. And this time, it sounded even more familiar, as if it was speaking directly to me. "The answer is Thursday, July 4th, 1776, Siri said. My heart skipped a beat. The room seemed to close in on me. My palms went clammy, and I felt a wave of nausea rush over me. What's going on? I thought. This wasn't just some random glitch. This was too specific, too deliberate. My phone had never responded like this before, not once. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Why that date? What did it mean? I shakily picked up the phone, thinking that maybe I had accidentally activated Siri through some voice command, some random occurrence. But when I looked at the screen, I didn't see anything useful. No apps were open, no notifications, no settings that could explain this bizarre moment. Just the typical lock screen. Maybe it was a mistake, I convinced myself, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe it's just Siri doing what Siri does, misinterpreting my voice. But deep down, I knew this didn't feel like any ordinary malfunction. And then, as if on cue, the phone's screen flickered back to life. It didn't require any input from me. Siri came to life again, her voice coming through clear and unprompted. I didn't know whether to be frightened or confused, but the words that came next made my blood run cold. "Here's the information for my full name," Siri's voice declared, like an automated news anchor reading off details only it could know. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a command. It was as though the phone knew something about me that I hadn't told it something only I knew. I dropped the phone in shock, my heart racing faster than I could process the words I had just heard. The room suddenly felt too small, too confined. I stood there, staring at the phone, hoping that somehow I had just imagined the whole thing. But there it was, the voice repeating those chilling words, like some kind of ominous message meant only for me. I turned the phone over, trying to gather my thoughts, but no matter how much I willed the situation to make sense, it didn't. I couldn't find any reason for Siri to know my name or reference a date so deeply embedded in history. What was going on? Who was playing this sick joke? Was I really just hearing things? Or was there something more sinister happening here? With a shaking hand, I checked the entire house, moving from room to room, hoping for an explanation. But the house was empty. The silence was deafening. Everything was as it should be, except for this haunting, unexplained voice. No one was here. No one had come in. Yet the words kept echoing in my mind. I stood in the middle of my living room, trembling with a mixture of confusion and terror. Something about this whole experience felt deeply wrong. I couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a mistake. This felt like a message, a warning, or worse, a sign of something I wasn't ready to understand. The phone lay silent now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore, not in the way I had been before. Something was watching, listening, waiting, and I was beginning to wonder if I would ever truly feel safe in my own home again. It was one of those nights when everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The kind of night where the world outside feels still, as if it's taking a break from the hustle of the day. I was alone in the house, curled up on the couch with a blanket, watching a movie. The warmth from the TV light bathed the room, casting long shadows on the walls. The quiet outside matched the stillness inside. But then, in the middle of the scene, just as I was getting drawn into the plot, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible knock. At first I dismissed it, telling myself it was just the wind or the house settling. After all, the old house creaked from time to time. But the sound was different. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone had gently rapped their knuckles on the window. I turned, half expecting to see the shadow of a branch against the glass, blown by the wind. But no. There was nothing. The window was clear, untouched. The night outside was dark, the street lights casting faint pools of light across the driveway. But no one was there. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head, trying to calm myself. It's nothing, I thought. Probably just an animal, maybe a tree branch moving in the wind. I turned back to the movie, but my mind kept drifting back to that knock. Was I imagining it? I wondered. Maybe it was a trick of the ears, a sound from the movie itself that my brain had misinterpreted. But then a second knock came, louder this time, and then another. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't soft anymore. It was clear, steady, and repetitive. It echoed in the room, like a call from the outside. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I froze. A cold wave of unease washed over me. spreading from the pit of my stomach to the tips of my fingers. Something wasn't right. I hesitated, debating whether to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just some harmless noise easily explained away. But the knocks came again, each one more insistent than the last. They were steady, like a rhythm that had been deliberately set to draw my attention. Why now? Why here? Why like this? I got up, the blanket falling from my shoulders as I moved toward the window. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath became shallow, as though I was holding on to some unspoken fear. I approached the window cautiously, my hands trembling as I pulled back the curtain. The room was dark, but the streetlights outside cast a faint glow across the yard. There was no one there. I peered out, scanning the quiet street, the empty driveway. But still, the knocking continued. Not on the window anymore, but somewhere just beyond the glass. It sounded closer now, almost too close. I strained my eyes, trying to make sense of it. What's going on? The knocks kept coming, this time harder and faster, like someone was desperately trying to get my attention. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Something inside me screamed that I shouldn't open that window. But curiosity and fear pushed me forward. My hands reached for the handle, and just as I was about to pull it open, I stopped. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone lurking in the corner, watching me. But there was nothing. Just the same shadows, the same quiet hum of the TV in the background. Still, the knocking continued, relentless, unyielding. I took a deep breath, closing my eyes for a moment to calm myself. Maybe it was just some prankster, or perhaps I had become too caught up in the quiet of the night. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized something. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't explain it away. The knocking wasn't random. It wasn't just the wind. It felt deliberate. And in the pit of my stomach, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't imagining this. I backed away from the window, my heart still racing, and the knocking seemed to follow me. It was no longer coming from outside. It was inside my head, echoing in my ears, louder than ever. I didn't know who or what was behind it, but one thing was certain: I wasn't going to be able to ignore it anymore. The quiet that followed felt more oppressive than the knocks themselves. The stillness had become unbearable, and I knew that whatever was out there was no longer just a mystery. It was something I was going to have to face. But as I stood there, staring at the empty street outside, I couldn't shake the thought that the real question wasn't who was knocking. It was why. The knocking had stopped, but something in the air still felt thick, heavy. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, racing with each passing second. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know. Who was out there? Why were they knocking on my window at this hour? My mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, none of them comforting. I stood frozen for a moment, fighting the overwhelming urge to run and hide. But curiosity pulled me forward. I slowly approached the window, my hand trembling as it reached for the handle. The house, which had felt so safe just hours ago, now felt like a trap. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the weight of the silence pressed down on my chest. Just open it, I thought. Just take a look. It's probably nothing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew that nothing would ever be the same after this. I took a deep breath and slowly pulled the window open. The cool night air rushed in, but it wasn't the fresh breeze I had expected. No, it felt different, oppressive, like it carried something with it. As soon as I opened it, I felt a cold, clammy hand shoot through the gap, a hand so fast, so sudden, that I didn't have time to react. It was as if someone had been waiting just outside the window, ready for this very moment. The fingers were pale, too pale, and the grip was strong, unnaturally so. I recoiled, pulling my hand back in shock. That's when I saw him. A man, standing right outside the window. He was dressed in black, his clothes blending into the darkness around him, like he was part of the night itself. But what truly terrified me were his eyes. They were glowing, bright, piercing, as if they had been carved out of the darkness. They were fixed on me, unblinking, unrelenting. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just stared at him. My breath caught in my throat, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. Was this real? I asked myself. Is this really happening? The man didn't speak. He just stood there, his eyes never leaving mine, as if daring me to make the first move. And in that moment, everything I had ever known about fear seemed too small, too insignificant. The terror wasn't just in his appearance. It was in the stillness between us, the way the world seemed to stop around us. The weight of his gaze seemed to crush the air out of my lungs. Then, as if to snap me out of my paralysis, he moved. His hand, the same cold, clammy hand, reached in farther, pulling at the edge of the window. I gasped, stumbling back. My mind screamed at me to shut the window, to run, to do anything. But I couldn't. I was frozen, my body unwilling to move. What do I do? I thought, panic rising in my chest. He's too close. What if he gets inside? Adrenaline surged through my veins. I took a step forward and pushed my hands against the window frame, desperate to close it. But the man wasn't letting go. His grip was like iron, his fingers digging into the wood. I could feel the pressure building, and in that moment, I realized something terrifying. He wasn't just trying to get in. He was trying to take me. A fierce struggle erupted between us. I pushed with all my strength, but the man was strong, his other hand now pulling at the window, inch by inch. The more I tried to fight back, the more it felt like I was losing. My fingers slipped, the sweat on my palms making it hard to grip. My heart pounded, and for a moment, I thought I wouldn't be able to stop him. But then, in an instant, something changed. The man suddenly pulled back, his hand retreating from the window as if something had startled him. I slammed the window shut with a loud crash, locking it with trembling hands. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. I stood there, my back pressed against the wall, my body shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know if I should look out the window again. I didn't know if I could. Slowly, I turned and peered out the window, my heart still in my throat. The man was gone. The yard was empty, the darkness swallowing everything in its path. I stared into the night, my mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. But as I looked, something deep within me knew one thing for certain. He wasn't gone. Not really. He was out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. And I had no idea if I would ever be safe again. The night had changed everything. It was one of those quiet evenings, the kind where the world outside seems to pause, and the only sounds that fill the air are the faint hum of the TV and the occasional rustle of leaves from the trees outside. I was sitting on the couch, trying to relax after a long day. The flickering light from the television cast soft shadows on the walls, and everything felt normal, peaceful even. But that peace didn't last long. As I settled into the couch, absorbed in the show, I began to hear something. At first it was subtle, almost like a faint creak, a sound that could easily be ignored. But then it came again, louder this time. A series of slow, deliberate thuds. The kind of sound you might expect if someone were walking around above you. But the thing was, no one was upstairs. The attic, which was directly above the living room, had been locked up for as long as I could remember. There was no one living up there. No one even used it. So, what was causing the noise? I froze for a moment, listening intently. The thuds continued, each one echoing slightly, like footsteps moving from one end of the attic to the other. It wasn't the house settling. I knew that much. This was something else. Something deliberate. My heart started to race, a knot forming in my stomach. The feeling of unease washed over me, creeping into my thoughts, whispering that something wasn't right. I tried to shake it off, but it was impossible. The sounds kept coming, step by step, slow and heavy, as if whatever was up there was moving carefully, almost like it was trying not to be heard, but failing at it. I couldn't concentrate on the show anymore. The noise was all I could think about. I glanced around the room, as if somehow looking at the walls might give me an answer. But the room was just as still as it had been moments before. Still, the sound persisted. My mind raced. It's just an animal, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon or something in the attic. It could be harmless. But the more I thought about it, the less convinced I became. The noises were too precise, too human-like. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to check. I stood up, the anxiety twisting in my chest, and walked toward the hallway. My brother's room was the closest to the attic, and his closet had the only access point. I tried to steady my breath as I approached his door. It was closed, just like it had always been. I didn't want to disturb him, but curiosity and a growing sense of dread pushed me forward. I reached for the handle and opened it slowly. The air in the room felt colder than usual. I quickly stepped inside, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling creeping over me. I moved toward the closet, where the trapdoor to the attic was. It was just a small door, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. I pulled the latch, and it opened with a creak that seemed to echo far too loudly in the stillness of the room. I hesitated for a moment, listening. The noise had stopped, leaving only silence in its wake. But I couldn't ignore it, that nagging feeling that something was off, that something was waiting. I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and turned it on, the beam slicing through the darkness above. The light flickered at first, casting long, shaky shadows along the attic floor. I stepped in, the creaking of the wooden steps underfoot sending a chill down my spine. I didn't even know what I was expecting to find. The attic was nothing special. It was dusty, cluttered with old boxes and forgotten furniture. Yet, something about it felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with an unease that I couldn't explain. I reached the top of the stairs and looked around. But the light didn't help much. It barely illuminated the corners, leaving most of the room in shadow. There was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. The thudding had stopped, and now the attic was as quiet as the rest of the house. But the silence felt wrong. It felt forced, like it was waiting for something. I scanned the room slowly, my eyes darting from one corner to another, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. No animal, no person, nothing. But why had I heard those footsteps? Why had they stopped so suddenly when I came up here? I didn't stick around to find out. Without thinking, I backed away from the attic, pulling the door shut behind me. I felt a rush of relief as the door clicked into place. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been up there hadn't gone far. The noises had stopped, but I didn't feel any safer. Not really. I walked back into the living room, but the unease lingered. The silence now seemed louder than before, filling the space with an uncomfortable weight. It wasn't just the sound of the footsteps that bothered me anymore. It was the knowledge that something or someone had been there waiting, moving just above my head. I stepped into the attic, the air growing colder with each movement, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The faint light from my flashlight barely illuminated the narrow space in front of me, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. My heart raced as I made my way through the cluttered room, the wooden floor creaking under my weight with every step. There was something about the place that felt wrong, as if the darkness itself was alive, watching me from the corners of the room. Then it came again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, almost too heavy to be just the house settling. The sound was coming from the far end of the attic, the area where the light barely reached. My pulse quickened, and I felt an icy chill crawl up my spine. It was as if the very air around me had thickened, becoming dense with something I couldn't quite name. I wasn't alone. I was sure of it now. Someone or something was up here with me. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw it. A shadow. It was fleeting, almost too fast to catch. But I saw it. A dark figure, moving between the boxes and old furniture, just out of reach of the light. My breath hitched, and for a split second, I was frozen in place, unsure of what to do. The figure was gone before I could blink, leaving only the silence behind. But that silence was deafening, heavy with the knowledge that I wasn't imagining things. Something was here, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to run, to get out of the attic and away from whatever was up there. But I couldn't. I couldn't turn away. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me with a loud thud that echoed through the house. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath shallow as I stumbled back down the stairs, my mind racing with fear. I didn't know what had just happened. I didn't know if I had seen something real, or if my mind had played a cruel trick on me. But I knew one thing. I had to tell my parents. I had to make sure they knew what was going on, even if I couldn't explain it myself. When they came home, I was already waiting for them in the living room, my eyes wide with fear. I explained everything, the noises, the shadow, the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over me. But when we went back upstairs to the attic, my parents found nothing. No signs of anyone or anything out of place. The boxes were just as they had been. There were no footprints, no disturbances in the dust, nothing to suggest that anything had been there. At first I felt a wave of relief. Maybe it had all been my imagination, my fear getting the best of me. But as I stood there, staring at the empty attic, that feeling of unease didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. Something about it still didn't sit right with me. My eyes scanned the room, trying to make sense of it all. But the silence was oppressive, almost suffocating. It wasn't the absence of proof that bothered me. It was the feeling that something had been there. Something had moved in the shadows, and no one else could see it. I had felt it. I had heard it. I had seen it. And no matter how much my parents tried to reassure me, the feeling of dread still lingered. It hung in the air like a thick fog, clouding my thoughts and weighing heavily on my chest. I tried to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, that I had let my mind wander too far. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was still up there. And no matter how many times I went back, no matter how many times I searched the attic, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Something was waiting, hidden in the shadows, just beyond my reach. And I wasn't sure when it would come for me next. It was a quiet afternoon in the house, the kind of stillness that you could feel in your bones. The air hung heavy, almost too calm, with the faintest hum of the refrigerator in the background. I was sitting in the living room, enjoying the peace, when I heard Layla, my dog, barking furiously from the basement. At first I dismissed it. Layla barked from time to time, especially when she spotted something outside. But this was different. Her barks were frantic, almost desperate. The sound carried up the stairs, growing louder and more intense with each passing second. I stood up from the couch, my heart skipping a beat. What could be down there, I wondered. Layla never acted like this. She was a calm dog, never easily frightened or aggressive. Something was off. I walked toward the basement door, each step feeling heavier than the last. The closer I got, the more the sense of unease gripped me. My instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. I reached for the doorknob, but before I could open it, I paused. The barking grew more intense, almost frantic, as if Layla was trying to warn me. Her growls mixed with the sharp barks, a sound I had never heard from her before. I hesitated, but then my concern for her outweighed my fear. I had to make sure everything was okay. I opened the basement door slowly, and the sound of Layla's barking hit me like a wave. It was so loud, so relentless. I stepped into the dark stairwell, the wooden steps creaking under my weight as I descended. The basement was cold, the air thick with the smell of must and old wood. I turned on the light, but it flickered before coming on fully, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. Layla was standing at the foot of the stairs, her body tense, her tail rigid. She was staring at the far corner of the basement, her eyes locked on a closed door. The growls were deep in her throat, her barks echoing off the walls, more intense than ever. I had never seen her act this way before. She was always the protector, but now she seemed terrified. "Layla, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. I took a step forward, trying to calm her, but she didn't respond. Instead, her barking grew louder, more frantic, as though she was trying to communicate something that I couldn't understand. I moved closer to the door she was fixated on, my stomach churning with unease. The door was old, its wood worn with age, but it seemed oddly out of place. I had never noticed it before. Why hadn't I ever noticed it? I felt a creeping sense of dread settle in my chest as I looked at it. "Is there someone in there?" I asked, though I knew no one was supposed to be down here. I waited for a response, but all I got was Layla's insistent barking, now laced with fear. Her stance was rigid, every muscle in her body tight, her eyes wide with panic. She was looking at that door like it held a dark secret, something that she couldn't explain but was trying to protect me from. My mind raced. Should I open the door? I thought. Should I check? What if there's someone in there? What if it's worse? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but the need to understand what was happening pushed me forward. I stepped closer to the door, my hand reaching for the handle. But just as my fingers brushed against the cool metal, I stopped. Layla's barking had reached a deafening crescendo, her body now trembling with fear. The air in the basement felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I pulled my hand back quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. The air around me seemed to change, thickening with a presence I couldn't see. The shadows in the corner of the basement felt deeper, darker. I could feel it now, that unmistakable sense of being watched, of being not alone. I stepped back, my body shaking, unsure of what to do next. But one thing was clear. I was no longer in control. Something was down there. Something that even Layla, my brave and loyal dog, was afraid of. And I had no idea what it was, or what it wanted. As I stood in front of the basement door, the unease in my chest grew heavier with each passing second. Layla, still on edge, continued to bark frantically, her body shaking with tension. Her eyes were locked onto the door, her growls deep and insistent, as if she was trying to warn me of something I wasn't yet ready to understand. My heart raced, and for a moment, I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. Something about the door felt off. It wasn't just the strange behavior of Layla, there was something about the door itself. Something that didn't sit right. As I took a step closer, my eyes caught something strange. There, near the handle, was a mark. It wasn't just a scratch or a smudge, it was a clear, deliberate sign. The wood around the handle was scuffed, as if someone had tried to force the door open. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Someone had tried to get in. My stomach turned. I stepped back, feeling a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Who could have been down here? And why was the door left like this? The more I thought about it, the more the fear began to settle in. This wasn't just an animal or a harmless mistake. The marks were too intentional, too deliberate. I quickly turned to Layla, whose constant barking and frantic movements only confirmed what I feared. Whatever had been in the basement, whatever had been in the shadows, was no longer there. But the damage was done. I didn't wait another second. Grabbing Layla by the collar, I rushed upstairs, my heart still hammering in my chest. I locked the basement door behind me, making sure every other door in the house was shut tight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in this house anymore. That someone had been here, had tried to get inside, and they might still be nearby. I kept Layla close, her body trembling under my hand, and I huddled in the living room, not knowing what to do next. The minutes stretched into hours as I waited for my parents to return, hoping they would bring some sense of normalcy back to the situation. When my parents finally came home, I explained everything. The strange behavior of Layla, the barking, the marks on the basement door. They listened, but their faces showed concern rather than disbelief. We all went downstairs to check again. As we approached the basement door, something was immediately wrong. The door, the one I had locked, was now ajar, wide open. My heart stopped. I stood frozen as my parents moved cautiously toward the door. Inside, it was a mess. The once neatly stacked boxes had been knocked over, and there were signs of movement, disturbed items, and worse. The floor was covered with footprints, dirt and grime smeared across the tiles. But the most chilling part was the door itself. The lock was broken, the wood around it splintered, as if someone had forcibly pried it open. "Someone's been in here," my dad muttered. his voice low and tense. The police arrived shortly after, and as they inspected the damage, their faces went grim. They confirmed what I had feared. The marks on the door and the broken lock weren't just signs of a random event. They were signs of a break-in. The police mentioned it was likely a burglar, someone who had been watching the house, waiting for the right moment to strike. They took down details, dusted for fingerprints, and even spoke about increasing patrols in the area. But the words that stayed with me, that echoed in my head long after they left, were the ones they said last. This wasn't just a random break-in. Someone knew exactly where to look. Suddenly, everything seemed to make sense, and yet nothing made sense at all. The fear that had been brewing in my chest, that gnawing sense of dread, was no longer just a feeling. It was reality. The man who had tried to get into the basement was no stranger. He had known this house, knew exactly where to go, and for some reason had wanted in. Layla's barking, her frantic warning, had been the only thing that had kept me safe, kept us safe. And now, as I sat there in the aftermath, I couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of the truth. Whatever had been lurking in the dark, whatever had tried to break in, was still out there. And it was only a matter of time before he returned. In the quiet of an old house, a child would often sit by the window, staring out into the darkness that stretched beyond. The house creaked and groaned as it settled, and outside the wind would whistle through the cracks in the walls. It was a house full of whispers, full of strange noises that the child had grown used to. Yet, there was something more to it. Something that had caught the child's attention time and time again. Through the window, shadows would move. At first, the child thought it was just the wind, swaying the branches of the trees or the leaves rustling in the yard. But as the days passed, the child began to notice something else. The shadows weren't like the ones made by the trees. These were different. They seemed to move with purpose, shifting and twisting just beyond the glass. They never came closer, but they always lingered, like something waiting, watching. The child would squint into the night, trying to make out the shapes. Sometimes they would catch a glimpse of something, a fleeting figure, perhaps, or a darker patch of shadow in the distance. But every time, when the child tried to look again, it would disappear, swallowed by the dark. There was no sound, no movement, just the quiet, empty space where something should have been. It wasn't long before the child grew used to it. These strange shadows, these figures in the night, became part of the house. Perhaps they were just figments of imagination, the child thought. Perhaps they weren't real at all. But then, one night, everything changed. It was late, and the child lay in bed, trying to fall asleep. The room was quiet, save for the soft rustling of the wind outside. The child stared up at the ceiling, willing sleep to come. But as the minutes ticked by, something else began to make itself known. A soft, subtle noise. A creak. The sound of something shifting in the dark. The child turned toward the closet. The noise was coming from there. It sounded like something brushing against the wood. Or maybe footsteps? The child sat up, straining to hear. The room was dark, but the soft moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting faint shadows across the floor. The closet door was barely visible in the corner, its outline dark and ominous. The child squinted, heart beginning to race. Was someone in there? A deep feeling of unease settled in, as if something wasn't quite right. But after a long moment of silence, the child convinced themselves it was nothing, just the house settling. Just the wind again. But then, the sound came again, louder this time. A soft scrape against the wood, like something moving inside. The child's breath hitched. The fear was sudden and overwhelming. There was no mistaking it now. The noise was real. It wasn't just the house. Something was in the closet. The air seemed to grow thicker, heavier with each passing second. And then, just when the child was about to call out, to run, to scream, the bedroom door creaked open. The child's heart stopped. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. A man. His face was shadowed, his features obscured by the dark. But the child could see enough to know that this was no dream. The man stood still, just outside the room, his presence suffocating, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. The child's mouth went dry, and a cold sweat broke out across their skin. The room felt impossibly small, as if the walls were closing in, trapping them. They couldn't move. They couldn't speak. They could only stare, frozen in place, as the man's figure loomed in the doorway, his dark eyes fixed on them. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. The silence in the room was deafening, but it was shattered by the child's scream as they suddenly bolted upright in bed. The man was gone. The door was closed. The room was empty. The child was left panting, heart racing, the sound of their breath loud in their ears. Had it been a dream? Had it all been a nightmare? But as they looked around the room, the shadows on the walls seemed darker than before, and the familiar sound of the wind outside no longer felt comforting. One thing was certain. Whatever the child had seen, whatever had stood in that doorway, wasn't a figment of imagination. It was real. And it was waiting. The moment the man appeared in the doorway, something snapped inside the child. Panic flooded through every inch of their body, and without thinking, they screamed. The sound shattered the silence of the room, raw and instinctual, as if their very life depended on it. The child's voice echoed off the walls, louder than the pounding of their heart, a desperate plea for safety. The figure in the doorway flinched, his body jerking back as if the scream had physically struck him. For a brief second, there was a flicker of hesitation in his movement, and in that fraction of time, something inside the child stirred fear. Yes, but also a spark of hope. Maybe the scream had been enough to drive him away. Maybe it had been a warning, a sign that they were no longer the prey, but had become the predator. But that hope quickly withered. The man didn't retreat. He didn't flee. Instead, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, slipping away with a quiet, unsettling grace. The child's breath caught in their throat, the tension in the room so thick it felt suffocating. For a long moment, the only sound was the child's frantic heartbeat, each thud ringing in their ears like a drum of doom. Frozen under the covers, the child lay still, not daring to make a sound. Their body was rigid with fear, their limbs trembling beneath the blanket. The night had turned against them. The warmth that the covers had once provided now felt like a suffocating trap. They kept their eyes shut tight, as though somehow closing themselves off from the nightmare that had just unfolded. Don't move. Don't make a sound. The minutes felt like hours. The silence stretched on, thick and unnerving. The child's breathing was shallow, each breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to push the panic back down, trying to regain control. But the images of the man, standing there in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the room, were burned into their mind. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the child slowly began to uncoil from their terrified state. The room was still, and for the first time, the child could hear the faint whisper of wind outside, the usual comforting sounds of the night. But the comfort was gone. The fear, still lingering in their chest, had made sure of that. Slowly, carefully, the child pulled the blanket away, their hands shaking as they let it fall to the floor. They slid their feet out from under the covers, their body reluctant to leave the safety of the bed. Each step toward the door was heavy, laden with doubt. The child reached the door and hesitated, their heart racing. Was he still out there? Had he stayed? With a deep breath, the child turned the knob and stepped into the hallway. The house was eerily quiet. There were no more footsteps, no signs of life. The door to the room was still open, just as it had been when the man had appeared. It was wide enough to see the empty, dark space beyond. But it was clear now the figure was gone. A wave of relief flooded over the child, but it didn't last. The room felt hollow, like something important had been taken from it. The fear that had gripped the child wasn't gone. It still lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. Its presence still felt in the cold air. The child stepped cautiously back into the room, eyes scanning every corner. The bed was undisturbed, the curtains still hanging in the same place. But something was off. Something had changed. The door had been open. The man had been there. And though he was gone now, the child knew that whatever had happened that night, whatever had brought the man into their room, wasn't over. The fear remained deep in their chest, a constant reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The child locked the door behind them, their fingers trembling as they twisted the key. It didn't make them feel safer, nothing could, but it was a small comfort, a tiny barrier between them and the unknown. They climbed back into bed, pulling the covers over their head once more, their eyes wide open in the dark, knowing that sleep would not come easy that night. Not anymore.